Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California, I'm Krista, and we are the Sixth Sense Society. Welcome to another episode of the Sixth Sense Society. We're really happy to have on board Dr. George Schwimmer, also known as my father, who will be talking about Edgar Cayce and past life recall. Before we get into a little bit more about him and the show itself, however, I'm going to kick it over to Michael because he has an announcement to make.
Hey gang, really looking forward to the show tonight. I think it's going to be a super interesting topic. We're actually pre-recording this show, so you'll be hearing it a little bit later on, and we haven't formalized our shows for the end of May quite yet. So for information on those, just go to our website, sixthsensesociety.com, and you'll find all the information there, and you can find out what the next show is going to be when the time comes. So hopefully that will just make it easy for you guys. And of course, we'll find information, links to all of our guests, and you just go to our videocast podcast page and you'll find all the information if you want to get in touch with them. And so there's some great people, so hopefully you guys will take advantage of that. So I'm going to keep this brief, so I'm going to kick it back over to Krista and we'll jump right into the show, and let's have a great show, guys.
Great. Thanks, Michael. So my father has quite a diverse background and has a background initially in theater. His formal education includes a BA in Literature and Philosophy from Washington and Jefferson College, an MFA in Theater Directing and Acting from Carnegie Institute of Technology, advanced graduate studies at Tulane University, and his PhD in theater from Columbia Pacific University. He has directed over 40 plays and a short film, so that's one part of his life. Tonight, his metaphysical background is important to know as well. He read early on There's a River by Thomas Sugru, which was the beginning of his journey on some level because he was introduced to Edgar Cayce, one of the most amazing documented clairvoyants of our times. Dr. Schwimmer has also been studying and practicing metaphysical disciplines for over 40 years. He's a certified past life therapist trained by the Association for Past Life Research and Therapy, serving on its board of directors for 4 years. He also practiced past life therapy for over 12 years. He was trained at the Arthur Ford International Academy of Mediumship to give spiritual past life readings and also as a spirit releasement therapist. He trained as a shaman with Dr. Alberto Velido and the Four Winds Society, starting in July of 2005, becoming a full Mesa carrier in October 2006, and receiving the Muni Kai rights in February 2007. He's also a Reiki master. I took the first 2 degrees with him when I was younger. By my count, Dad, you've written over, it looks like 20 books, which are all available on Amazon under his name, George Schwimmer, as well as screenplays, stage plays, including one on Edgar Cayce, which I think is really amazing. So as you can see, he has a rich background, both in drama and in metaphysics. So welcome, Dad. We're really happy you are talking with us today by phone. So what would you like to start with? Do you want to start with a little bit of the background of the past life, a little bit about yourself?
I want to start with when it all started. My first spiritual teacher in 1978 was the Reverend Marion Starnes of Charlotte, North Carolina. And in addition to being a minister, she was a phenomenal psychic. And she used to come to Raleigh once a month. And for, I think, about 2 years, I would go and listen to her talks. And the only thing I remember her saying, which at the time I found confusing, she said, "We are all one." And that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me until until later. Now, to make sense out of reincarnation, I want to go back to when everything was created. And according to various people, including the Bible, the spiritual universe was created first and then the physical universe. And the question I had about that was, created from what? We'll never get an answer to where God came from, but God created the universe. What did he create it out of? But specifically, what did he create the spirits out of? If there was nothing but God, then what were the little spirits created from? And the obvious answer, which wasn't very obvious to me years ago, is that they were created out of God itself. And that sounds a little weird and confusing, at least it was to me. But if you consider something like a bowl of water, and if you spill it on the floor, you'll see a lot of small drops of water of various sizes. If you then manage to get it all back together again, then you have one big piece of water, quantity of water.
Mm-hmm.
And so just like water, you can have an ocean and have millions of drops, and they can evaporate and they can rain, and then they all go back into the ocean again. And I believe that is how spirit also works.
Yeah, that's a great analogy for sure.
So we as spirits, or as entities, as Cayce liked to call us, we actually weren't created. We were separated, in a manner of speaking, from God. We are all bits and pieces of God, which your authorities will say means we have all of the attributes of God.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, one of the things that really struck me when I read the Bible was that Jesus says, "Ye are gods." And for years and years and years, it made absolutely no sense to me. Now it does, when I consider that we were and are parts of God.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this goes even further, and this will explain, in part at least, how reincarnation works. I am not going to reincarnate. I, George Schwimmer, and am not reincarnating. I am a part of my entity, or as I prefer to call it, my higher self, and I will go on to have other experiences in other realms. People call it heaven, whatever. But I, as George Schwimmer, will not reincarnate. Okay, so how does that work? Well, if you consider, look at the entity as being a sun, and the sun has these rays coming off it, as you often see in drawings. Each one of those rays is a person. And so each of those incarnations belongs to the entity.
I like that.
Okay? So even though you die physically in this life, you go on to other experiences which for the most part we don't know about and we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
But that is, I believe, that reincarnation works. Now, spirits weren't, according to Edgar Cayce, these entities weren't supposed to come to Earth. But according to Cayce, they found the Earth so fascinating, they came down here and they not only observed, but again, according to Cayce, they would pop into and out of everything.
Mm-hmm.
Animals, trees, rocks, rivers. They had the capability of getting inside each of these and experiencing them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they found this so fascinating that eventually, Cayce said, they started to forget they were spirits. And this is when all the trouble started. And this is where reincarnation eventually came in, when they were having all these adventures on planet Earth and did not remember they were spirits, and they were doing things that were not spiritual, and they had to go and either make up for it or learn different lessons about it. So, for instance, very interestingly, I had a student once who discovered he was gay when he was in his early 20s. And he became a writer. And eventually, he wrote several books. And one book that he wrote was obviously autobiographical. And he mentions having a dream where he was a guard at a Nazi concentration camp for gay men.
Ooh, wow.
And he comes back in this lifetime as a, and not only does he come back to experience what it feels like to be gay, but he became a writer of the gay experience, which had a profound effect on me reading what he wrote.
Wow.
And you may remember him as George Whitmore.
Oh, I didn't know that about him. Wow. Yeah, I do remember him definitely. Yeah. Wow, what an amazing... that's an interesting example of reincarnation too, because I think some people think you just get punished when you come back rather than seeing the other side of things, No,
what it really is about for the greatest extent is that you have the earth is a duality and you have to see it. So even if you didn't do anything wrong, you need to go and see what it feels like from the other end. So if you've been a king and you've been spoiled and you were rich and et cetera, this may really go to your head. So in another lifetime, you will be, in many cases, a pauper or a person who has to really struggle. And it's not a punishment. It's just simply to show you the duality of everything on the planet.
Right.
Now, a couple other things before I get to a more practical part here. Cayce said that spirits or entities at first were both male and female, and both the male and female part of the entity would reincarnate in a body. Well, after a while, for whatever reason, the male principle and the female principle separated. So now that there's for all practical purposes, two entities, one male and female, and they usually incarnate as males or females, but they will, again, because you have to experience everything in a duality, if you're the female part of the entity, you may experience, or you will experience at least a couple of male wives to experience what it feels like to be of the other sex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one interesting thing that I don't remember if it was Cayce or somebody else that said, and that is that the two parts of this entity don't normally reincarnate together, because if they both messed up, it could set them up tens of thousands of years. So they will normally incarnate at different periods of time. And the one exception, which I found fascinating, was Cayce said that Mary part of the same entity.
What was I couldn't quite hear that.
Mary, Jesus, and his mother Mary
were part of the same
entity. Mary was the female part, and Jesus was the male part of the entity.
Oh, I've never heard that. That's interesting.
Yes, it's very interesting. Okay, one other thing there's a couple of things I want to mention. We all have cosmic families, and you have supposedly about 100.
Oh, wow!
And these are the people you reincarnate with. And there are many reasons why you do this, but anyway, I just want to mention, that you have karmic families that you continually reincarnate with.
Mm-hmm.
And to prepare for this, I just sat down and I thought, based on my recalls, what do I recall the people who I have recall of. And I've incarnated with my father, my mother, my 3 children, my ex-wife, 8 women, a male playwright, a male philosophy professor, and a female student that I know about.
Mm-hmm.
So that indicates that we don't come here to, freelance all by ourselves. We incarnate with other people, and usually you have very specific things that you are trying to work out with each other. And you will have a planning session before you come on Earth with others who are going to incarnate with you, and also with your spirit guides. And most people have five or more spirit guides, and they help you not only during your life, but as you're planning your incarnations.
So is that why sometimes when you meet someone, you feel like a connection with them?
I'm sorry?
So is that why when you meet people, sometimes you feel a strong connection because you're part of the same cosmic family?
Yes, definitely. I had one very unusual thing happen to me 3 times. The first time it was a young woman I was thinking about getting married to. Second time was my ex-wife. And the third time it was a professor of Greek from Bennington College whose play I was directing. And in all 3 situations, when I first glanced at them, a spark of golden light came from their forehead and hit mine.
Oh, wow, that's really unique.
That it's very strange. I don't understand what it is, but obviously we had some kind of connection.
Right.
Okay. Last thing I want to mention then, that's free will and predestination. I had a philosophy professor, and I asked him, a literature professor once, and we were talking about free will and predestination, and he said it's both. And I couldn't quite understand that at the time, and I think I understand it now. I remember this one famous psychic, I can't think of her name now, but anyway, she said some things are set and cannot be changed. They're determined by everybody, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the cases of your life, you made this plan. So, for instance, you're supposed to meet somebody in this lifetime when you're 22 years old. Okay, that's set in stone. What you do with that person is your free will. You can either hook up with them or not hook up with them. It's up to you. But the meeting is part of the plan that you determined. Okay, I wanted to get those general things out first. Now I want to go and start with the background of the greatest psychic the 20th century is known, and possibly either the greatest psychic or one of the greatest psychics of all time, which is Edgar Cayce.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes back. You need to put it into some kind of a context, because when I first ran across him, and when I first started reading about Cayce and other people like them, healers and other psychics, it just seemed like, well, all these people are just sort of freaks in matter of speaking. They seem to come out of nowhere and seem to have no connection to anything, and just suddenly appear, and a book is written about them, and they're famous, etc. And it didn't make a whole lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
I believed that they had the abilities, but I couldn't understand, where it fit into the human experience. So I discovered with Cayce that it began with the German Franz Mesmer, who discovered what he called was magnetism, and he would put people into a trance state. I believe he used some kinds of passes, which I believe had to do with the chakras. But anyway, this wasn't really hypnotism, but he put people into altered states. Now, a man named the Marquis de Puysegur, I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, a Frenchman, he lived 1751 to 1825. He went to Paris to observe Mesmer, came back and began experimenting with one of his peasants who was called Victor. And in trance, he discovered what we call the hypnotism now. And in trance, Victor was very much brighter. Victor wasn't very bright when he was in a normal state of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But when he was in this altered state, he was much brighter. He was more profound. He was more clear-sighted and had a totally different personality. Later, Carl Jung called this the self. Now, Victor diagnosed others and prescribed treatment. This is a person who's never had any education whatsoever. And very similar to which I'll mention with Edgar Cayce 80 years later. He remembered nothing of what he said in trance, which also happened with Edgar Cayce.
Right.
By 1789, there were about 200 French practitioners of this technique using other trance diagnosticians. Now, that's incredible.
Yes.
You know, well, you're going from 0 to 200 psychic diagnosticians, which to me seems to indicate that everybody basically has this capability.
Right.
And when the French Revolution came, it wiped out most of these practitioners, and the technique dropped out of use. However, hypnotism continued, and by 1880 to 1910, there was a great deal of interest in hypnosis in Europe. And one of the practitioners was a Colonel Albert de Rochas, a military officer, a historian, paranormal researcher, and hypnotist who was researching and practicing from 1885 to 1910. Now, this is the first modern Western individual that is recorded, and he wrote a book, and after that, other people picked it up on the continent, and I ran across some articles written in other languages, written on the continent, but that did not come to the United States, although hypnotism did. Now, there was Edgar Cayce was born in 1877, and he had a large family. They were mainly tobacco farmers, and there were a great many of them, but most of them were very ordinary people. Now, Cayce, there was strange things in his early life. Let me just mention the first biography that was written about him. It was called "There Is a River" by Thomas Sugrue, and it's written almost like a novel. So anyone who's interested in learning about Cayce, I suggest they read that first because it's easy reading.
Yes, it is.
Now, Cayce, his grandfather was psychic. He was what is called a water witch. And that means that he could find water anywhere and tell farmers where to dig their wells, and they always found water. He was killed by a horse when Edgar was 5, but a few weeks later, the spirit of the grandfather came back, and Edgar used to have long conversations with his spirit.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So you can start, you can start seeing that there's something strange going on here.
Yes.
Then when he was, I think, about 11, he was having trouble in school, and his uncle was a teacher, and his father was a very stern and rough guy, and they got very angry with Edgar because he couldn't seem to learn his lessons. And his father actually knocked him about a couple of times one night, and this spirit came to him and said, "If you'll sleep on your books for a couple of minutes, I'll help you." And so he asked his father if he could take a rest for a couple of minutes and lie down on his book. So his father was very angry, but he said, "Okay, do it." So Edgar lay down on the book for a couple of minutes, and when he got up, he knew everything in the book.
Yeah, that's something that he even was tested on, correct? like publicly, like that was something documented that he really did do. That's what I remember reading.
I don't remember that, but I know that when he went back to school the next day, he not only knew that book, but he knew everything else that was there, and which again infuriated his uncle and father because they thought he'd been fooling around. But anyway, Edgar didn't show any other abilities except one time, and I put this in the play when I wrote it. He got hit by a baseball on his spine, and he came home and he was acting crazy, and they put him to bed. And his father said, "Well, what had happened?" And Cayce suddenly started talking very rationally while his eyes are closed and he seemed to be asleep. And he said, "Well, I got hit by a ball, and my brain is going to be damaged if you don't go and put a poultice on the back of my neck." So they put this poultice on the back of his neck, and when he got up the next morning, he was completely cured.
Wow.
So this was an indication of things to come, but that was the only time that anything like that happened. Then when he was, I can't remember exactly how old he was. Oh, okay. He was 22. And something happened. I think he was given some kind of a cold medicine, and it somehow affected his voice, and he couldn't talk anymore. He could just barely talk in a whisper. And this was just a tragedy because he couldn't hold down a job. And the only job he could finally get was to work in a dark room of a photographer. And so he was absolutely miserable. And he had a girl, Gertrude, and he wanted to marry her. And he said, "Well, I can't marry her because who wants to marry a man who can't talk?" And finally, we get back to hypnosis. At this time, hypnotism was very popular, and you would have traveling hypnotists going around the country, hypnotizing people on stage and making them do odd things, squeal like a pig and crawl around on all fours and stuff like that. And so somebody said, "Well, maybe hypnotists could go and cure Cayce." So they took him to the hypnotist, and he hypnotized him. And in hypnosis, suddenly Cayce started talking normally, and everybody was absolutely delighted. And they brought him out of the hypnosis, and he couldn't talk. And they did it again, and it didn't work again. So finally, the hypnotist gave up. And then another hypnotist came to town, and the same thing happened. While under hypnosis, he could talk normally. Once he woke up, he couldn't speak again. So the second hypnotist went away. Well, there was a local hypnotist, an amateur, who decided he wanted to take a crack at it. He had an idea what was wrong. And so he talked his way into the Cayce family, and they said, "Okay, well, let's go ahead and do it." So he went and hypnotized them. And the hypnotist before him had said that Cayce would not go into the third stage, which is deep hypnosis.
Right.
And so this guy said to Cayce, "Well, why don't you put yourself into this stage?" And sure enough, Cayce put himself into this stage of hypnosis. And the guy had a thought, and he said, "Well, do you know what's wrong with you?" And he said, "Yes, the vocal cords were paralyzed because of this medicine or whatever. However, if you will tell the body," that was Cayce's words, "the body to go and direct blood to the area of the throat, this will cure him." And so the man said, "Okay, I direct the blood to go to his throat," and Cayce's throat became bright red.
Wow.
And it stayed bright red for a couple of minutes, went away. They woke Cayce up, and his voice was okay.
That's amazing. They're using hypnosis a lot for surgery now, we found out recently. It's kind of on the rise again too for healing modalities.
Well, I'll tell you what I would be interested in doing. You know, and if I had the money, I'd set up the study. They should set up a study with people who are known or who are suspected of being psychically sensitive, and see if they can do what Cayce did. Nobody's ever done that.
That would be great.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Well, anyway, so how are we doing on time right now?
Oh, I think we're still got a half an hour.
Okay, because I want to get to the past life recall also. All right, I want to give a couple of, before I forget, this third hypnotist that helped to cure him, his name was Lane, Layne, and Lane had a bunch of problems physically. And he had gone from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor, and they couldn't fix him. And so he asked Cayce if he would go into trance and diagnose him. So he went into trance, and he diagnosed him perfectly. Now let me mention, I didn't mention this, but Cayce only went to the 8th grade. He knew nothing about medicine, surgery, drugs, etc. Absolutely nothing. He diagnosed this guy perfectly. When he woke up, Cayce said, "Well, what did I say?" And Lane said, "You diagnosed me better than most of my doctors did, and you gave me a cure." And so Lane went and did what Cayce told him to do it, and he was cured. And he had whatever was wrong with him. I don't think was ever mentioned, but had been there for years and years and years and years and years. Mm. So that in itself was extraordinary.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to mention one of his cures, which is one of the most sensational. But he did about there are more than 14,000 recorded what he called readings. But he did a lot. He probably did a couple thousand more before he got a stenographer. Who started taking down what he said. But so I'm just mentioning this one particular case. This was the case of Tommy House. And Mrs. House was Cayce's wife's aunt, although she wasn't much older than Gertrude. And she had a difficult gestation. And when the baby was 6 months old, it started getting very ill, and it was convulsing. Oh. And finally, the mother, Carrie House, insisted that Edgar be brought. Edgar was living in Bowling Green, Kentucky at the time, and he came. And there were 2 doctors there, and one doctor just walked out. He was so angry, he said, "This man is a fake." And the baby was convulsing, I think, about every 20 minutes then. And so they asked Cayce to go into and do a reading, and Cayce lay down and did a reading. And when he woke up, he heard the doctor say he prescribed poison for the baby. And so, of course, that scared the wits out of Cayce. And so he goes into the living room where they were talking, and the doctor says what Cayce had prescribed was belladonna. Mm. You may have heard of that.
Yes.
Which is basically a poison. And he's prescribed, although it sometimes is used in medicine, but he said he prescribed a dose of belladonna, which will kill the baby. And the mother said, "I believe in Edgar." And so she said, "I'll give him the belladonna myself." And her husband was a doctor, and he went and got the belladonna, which he had, gave it to his wife. She gave it to the baby. And a minute or 2 later, the baby goes to sleep. The doctor goes over and puts this stethoscope on the baby, and the baby's heart is now normal. His breathing is normal, and the baby is sleeping.
Wow.
And
incredible.
The baby never had another problem. He grew up, and actually, I think he was working at the Cayce Institute years later.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was, and all kinds of strange things. he described the murderer and who was the murderer and what kind of weapon used and where the weapon was. And this was in Vermont, and he was in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And another time, he prescribed a certain medicine, and he was told by drug manufacturers and druggists and so on that this medicine no longer is being made. It was made 50 years ago or something like that. He goes back into trance and says, "Yes, there's one bottle left." And
that's amazing.
And he said, and he tells them where the drugstore is located and where the bottle is on which shelf.
Wow, that is
and
amazing.
Eventually, they found it, and it was on the shelf. So he also had far vision; he could see anywhere.
Well, that's interesting too, because a lot of people claim to be clairvoyants, and I'm not saying everyone's going to be Edgar Cayce, but they can't even remotely do any of that. I think that it kind of bothers me that, not because I think they're frauds, but that we do have these great abilities that we need to develop, maybe more than Edgar Cayce might have had a natural ability.
I've thought about that, but stop and think about it for a minute. If everybody knew everything everyone was thinking, how would that work? It simply wouldn't.
Right.
You'd have no privacy in your thoughts, and I don't see how it's possible for everybody to be as psychic as Cayce.
Well, even he went into the trance for many years. He didn't recall it, only with help. So that was maybe a safety mechanism too for him, so he can have a day-to-day life.
Okay, let me read you one paragraph here. It tells you what he did works. And this goes back to the beginning of what I talked about, that we are all connected. This is what he said. In this state, the conscious mind is subordinate to the subconscious or soul mind, which obtains information either from other subconscious minds or from minds that have passed on. What is known to one subconscious mind is known to another. The mind of this body in the subconscious state can therefore access all information, since every mind records all of its experiences. So if you are able to access your subconscious,
mm-hmm.
which apparently exists the way Carl Jung said it did, you can do what Cayce did.
Right.
Now, I'm just going to mention one other thing, that I want to go on to past life recall. He formed an association called Association for Research and Enlightenment. This was formed in 1931. It still exists today. It's had as many as 100,000 members, and usually has about 50,000 members, I believe, in the last few years. And all of Cayce's readings are in a library in Virginia Beach. And there's an interesting story about Virginia Beach, which I don't have time to tell, but if you read his biography, you'll find it quite interesting. And Cayce died in 1945. And one of the things, just want to very briefly mention, he mentioned some of his own past lives. And it's pretty extraordinary. There have been quite a few books written about different subjects that Cayce wrote about. And there's one book about Cayce's past lives. And also, he said that Jesus had 33 lives. And he mentioned and described some of these lives, a couple of which were, I think it was Elijah. Yeah, I think it was Elijah was one of Jesus' past lives. But anyway, even Jesus had to have more than one life, because everybody messed up. And according to Cayce, Jesus originally was Adam.
Oh.
And the reason that Jesus had to reincarnate was because Adam messed up in the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's symbolic, but anyway. Okay, so let me talk about a little bit about the work I did as a past life therapist.
Great.
And we don't have a whole lot of time to go back into the history of this, but there weren't any people doing past life therapy or anything like it. The first person that did was a man named A.R. Martin. He was a student of esoteric things, and he formed a group of people. And he had used hypnotism in college, and when they weren't getting answers to what they wanted to know about religion and so on, he remembered that he had done some hypnotic work in college to help him learn his studies, and so he started hypnotizing people, and that was when the first record of somebody doing what is past life recall in the United States was made. He wrote a book in 1942, and it was called, let me see, what was it called? Researches in Reincarnation. And then some people who are as old as I am will recall that a man named Maury Bernstein wrote a book called The Search for Bridie Murphy in 1956. And that created a great sensation because he hypnotized a woman, and she described in detail a life she had had in, I believe it was 19th century Ireland. And everybody called him a fraud, etc. But some people did research on it, and they found that the things she said were accurate. Well, that must have piqued the interest of every hypnotist in the United States, although we don't know. But the fact is that not only hypnotists, but other people started doing past life regressions. And the therapists who I talked with later said they would have a client, and when they would say to a client, why don't you close your eyes and see where your problem came from, and people would start talking about their past lives.
Yes, that's even happening today still.
So after a while, around 1980, 50 of these therapists and counselors, I think there was one psychiatrist, and people doing this kind of work, and they got together and they formed the Association of Past Life Research and Therapy. And that was formed in 1980. And that continued, I don't know, something like probably for 20, 25 years, and then it had inner problems and it sort of fell apart. But anyway, I learned about the association in, I think it was 1982, and I was interested in past lives, and I was fascinated with the idea of somebody being regressed to their past life. I had never been regressed, although I had Marion Stars talk to me about some of my past lives. And so I joined the organization, and about a year or two later, they set up a program to train people to do past life therapy. And although I didn't have a degree in psychology, there was no law that said I couldn't do it, because there was no licensing of people doing past life therapy. So I went and studied it, and I was living in New York at the time, and I commuted to California several times a year to take these trainings. And eventually, I completed the training, and I wound up being the first person completing that training and being certified to do past life therapy.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know that.
Now, yeah. So later, I got involved with them. I also was on the board of directors for 4 years, and I was a newsletter editor for 4 years. So I was really into this stuff. And again, I can't prove it, but it's very obvious to me that the people who first got involved with this from 1980 to about 1988, let's say, these are all people who we've known each other before in different circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
There's an organization like that, an unusual organization like that, coming together of all these people. We had to have known each other.
That makes sense.
In various situations. Okay. Now, I'd like to mention that what I do is somewhat different than most people. Hypnotists, most people will do what their teachers teach them to do and what they've been trained to do before. And so psychotherapists simply incorporate past life recall into their type of therapy. Hypnotist will do it hypnotically, et cetera, et cetera. I look at it from a point of view of this is a spiritual exercise, and I'll tell you why in a moment. This is not a psychological exercise, and one of the problems, I don't know what the situation is now because I've lost touch because the organization fell apart, but people, when I first started out, their mantra was, to relive is to relieve. In other words, if you remember what happened to you, then all your problems are gone. Well, that's baloney, number one. Number two, it doesn't address really what's going on because you have these problems recurring throughout lifetimes. I remember one woman who was just getting a divorce from her husband, and I regressed her, and she found that she had the same man as her husband, same person as her husband 6 times before, and they had never ironed out whatever was wrong with them. One time he was her father, and he killed her by smashing her head in with a rock.
Oh.
And so, it just, relieving it doesn't really do the trick. And I'll tell you how you go and fix it in a second.
Okay.
I just want to describe how the process works for me. Okay, some people, there's a group of people that want to regress you in 60 seconds. It can be done, and I tried it once and I found it very unsatisfactory, and so did my client, because they take you back, and what will happen is if they take you back to the trauma in the past life, you're going from 0 to 60 in a couple of seconds, and now you're experiencing the trauma that you experienced in the past life,
Yeah,
which
that's
is,
shocking.
I'll tell you right now, it's not cool.
Yeah.
It's not cool. So I go very slowly. I do a visualization of people going down an elevator, then taking a train to the past. And then I say, you get off the train and you look down and see what you're standing on. Now, the purpose of that is to ground the person in the past life. And so then they say, well, I'm standing on dirt. Fine. I'll look at your feet. Do you have anything on your feet? Sandals, shoes, whatever. No, I'm barefoot. Okay, look up your body. What are you wearing? And you keep on going until you have a picture of the person and a picture of the area where they're standing. And now that person is well grounded into past life. And peculiarly, I don't know why, but almost most of the times, people find themselves outdoors. And I don't know why, but it happened with me also.
Oh, that's
when
interesting.
I was regressed. Very, very rarely did the past life start out indoors. And so then we go through the day that the person is experiencing. Then there may be something happening or maybe not, but usually there's no great big trauma. And then I take them back to their birth. And actually, I go back to the point of conception because there's an awful lot of stuff going on in the womb. If the husband and the wife don't get along, the baby's going to know it.
Sure.
And the baby's going to be upset, and it can affect it for the rest of his or her life. So I need to go back to the moment of conception, and then I walk the person through the 9 months. What do you experience the first month, second month, third month? Usually they don't experience anything significant, but once in a while they do, and then we have to go and look into it. So then when the baby is born, I ask them to describe the birth and who's around and so on. And again, ask if there's anything significant that they need to tell me. Then we go to most significant 3 or 4 or 5 events in their life. And I will count to 3 every time they move to the new segment of the life. And they describe what is happening to them. And then finally, we get to the death, and they describe the death. Now, some therapists will take you not only through death, but they want to go on to what happens to you after you die.
Right.
I never did that because that has nothing to do with therapy. And, if I'm doing past life therapy, I'm not doing research. I'm doing therapy, and I don't see where it helps anybody what they're doing after they died. What I do at the end of this life, after they have died and they're out of body, I ask them to go to their higher self. Now, don't ask me what the higher self is. I don't know if that's the entity or if it's the soul, or I don't know. It's just a part of you that sees everything, knows everything, is very kind, very gentle, very wise. And I'll tell the person, okay, I want to count to 10, and I'm going to go, and I want you to raise your consciousness to the level of your higher self, and then you will tell me everything that your higher self communicates to you. And then I'll ask a bunch of questions, and the first question always is, why did this person choose that life? Because you choose a life. You don't just happen to fall into it. And so the higher self will tell me why they chose that life. And then the other most important thing that I ask is, well, how is what happened in that life connected with the present life? And they will explain how it is connected. And then I ask the higher self, well, is there something that this person needs to do to address whatever problem they came to me with? And this is where the therapy comes in. Up to this point, there's been nothing to do with therapy. But at this point, I'm not doing the therapy. The higher self is. All I have to do is sit back and listen to the higher self and ask a couple of questions. Okay, and that is the most critical thing of a past life recall, and I don't know how many people do that, to tell you the truth.
Don't you also do some healing with the past life? I remember going through your exercise, and there's some ways that you can actually consciously go back to heal.
I was just going to do that.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, so I think I'm going to finish with the higher self first, and then I'll get to answer your question. I think I wrote one article for the A-Part newsletter, and I wrote another article for our journal about the higher self. So I know there's other people doing it because I wrote articles about it. I don't remember where I got it from. I may have gotten it from Dick Sutphin, who was a popular past life regressionist, but I used it very early on. And if I didn't use the higher self, I couldn't do anything. It would I wouldn't have a clue how to help people. The higher self is the whole answer in a regression. Now, for healing, this again, when I start out doing this work, I had a group of spirit guidance counselors, if you like, who are working with me. And I can't identify them as personalities or anything, but I know that suddenly I'll be doing some work with a client, and suddenly an idea just pops into my head out of nowhere. And this is one of these ideas of healing the past life body. And my rationale for that is this person, although the physical body of the past personality or person is dead, this person, like my client right now, in their subconscious mind is carrying around an image of being eaten by a lion, being killed by a spear, jumping off a cliff. That's not a very good image to carry around in your subconscious.
No, it's not.
And so what I do is I say, okay, now we need to, let's say you were, I remember just recently I had a woman who was torn to pieces by a bear. And I said, I want you to go back and heal your past self. I said, do you see her? Yes, she's in pieces. Okay, I want you to arrange all the pieces and tell the bear to regurgitate the parts of the body that it ate and put them in the proper place. And now I want you to send a beam of light from your forehead, your two eyes, and your heart, and have these four beams converge into a single beam and shine that onto the damaged body of your past self and completely heal the body of your past self starting from the inside out. And then I say, I'll wait until you finish doing that. And the person will usually take a minute or two, and they will tell me they are healed. And then I have them speak to their past self and, in a manner of speaking, bond with their past self. Now, there's one other thing that I sometimes did for whatever reason at that point it seemed the right thing to do, and that is called rescripting. And I would ask the person, do you want to change anything in the past life? You can't change your whole life, but you can change one thing in that past life. Do you want to change one thing in that past life? And I remember this one woman who had killed her husband with a pitchfork. And I said, okay, what do you want to change? And she said, I wouldn't marry him.
Ah.
And I thought, well, she's a bright girl, isn't she? And I said, okay, go back in time and see the moment when he asked you to marry him. Do you see it? Yes. Okay, hear him ask you to marry him. He just asked me to marry him. Okay, tell him no. And she said no. From that point on, she started living another life.
Wow.
Okay.
Did she notice a change in this life too?
I didn't want to rescript her whole life.
Right.
I just wanted her to go and live a different life. Now, this sounds crazy, right?
Yes, it does a little.
It's not crazy. It's not crazy if you understand that all time is simultaneous. Okay? If all time is simultaneous and all events and all possible events are taking place at the same time, all a person is doing is moving their consciousness from this one track to another track.
Right.
Okay? So anyway, I did this rescripting with some people, and some of it was very touching. I didn't do it a lot, and I don't know if anybody else does it, or I know a few people did when I was doing this when I was in Los Angeles. But that's basically the way it works. Now I want to mention I put an entire session, all the techniques I've mentioned, and some more, on an audio tape. This happened about 30 years ago. A woman I met at a training wanted to be regressed when she found out I was a regressionist, and we didn't have time. It was a very packed-in training. And so I said, okay, let me go and put something on tape for you and mail it to you. And so I sat down and I recited an entire regression onto this tape. And then I tried it out on myself, and it worked fantastic. It was terrific. And so I sent it to her. And then several years later, I recorded it again, and I have been offering it for sale on my website. And if anybody's interested, in really getting a good regression that will not cause you any kind of problem, because you can't have problems caused if you have a bad regressionist. But I've never had anybody come back and say that it didn't work for them, or they had any kind of a bad experience.
Right. We are getting close to the end of the show now, so we'll have you wrap it up.
Okay. I want to mention one thing that one of my past personalities or persons said. The kinds of things that are said through the higher self are really sometimes extraordinary. And here's what I want to conclude with. These are the words of one of my past selves. He was a Greek soldier and philosopher, and his name was Dami. And he says, in 281 BC, I was a Greek mentor living in Athens, and I taught my students that we are all gods, for which I was executed by sword. My decision at the end of that life was, I must show everyone that life is beautiful, that we're made of starlight, that we're made of starlight, that we are beings of light, that our heritage is joy, and that we are all one. I promised my students I would return to again tell them this truth, and I am keeping my promise.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful, Dad. Thank you. That was a lot of great information. I know some of our people that watch us are really excited about this interview, so I think you'll have some really good feedback. So thank you all for watching. We will see you next week, and I'm not quite sure yet what the show will be, but thank you. Like us, check out our webpage at sixthsensesociety.com, and have a great week.